Usually when you ask people to name great musicians who completely changed the face of the music in the 1980s, very few of them will mention 36-year-old punk and new wave musician Peter Ivers. Ivers was a musical genius who transcended genres and paved the way for the likes of MTV, but his artistic talents remain relatively unknown today, overshadowed by his 1983 murder, which remains colder than ever and an ongoing puzzle to all of those who loved and adored him. As in his life and musical career, the king of counterculture's mysterious killing remains just on the outskirts of the zeitgeist, waiting to be brought into the light. This is a Truly Criminal podcast exclusive. This is the story of Peter Ivers. Peter Ivers was born Peter Scott Rose on the 20th of September 1946 in a typical suburb of Chicago to mother Merle, a beautiful and artistic housewife, and father Jordan Rose, a highly intelligent doctor. Young Peter's life would start as tragically as it would unfortunately end, when in 1949, when Peter was only 3 years old, his father passed away after a courageous 3-year-long battle with lung cancer. After her husband's death, Merle, always a little bohemian at heart, needed a change of scenery and decided to pack up all of her things and move with her toddler to another quiet and typical suburb, this time in Massachusetts. It was here in Brookline that Merle met a charming and charismatic businessman named Paul Eisenstein, and the pair dated for a short while before tying the knot when Peter was 4 years old. Strange for the time, both Merle and Paul decided to get married under the name of Ivers, which they had picked at random from a telephone directory one rainy Sunday afternoon, instead of Eisenstein. The peculiar name change didn't surprise anyone who knew Merle. She lived her life by her own rules and booked tradition with a passion whenever she had the chance, traits she would soon pass on to her son Peter. Peter was raised in a loving household that encouraged reading, discussion, free thinking and creativity, and Merle was immersing her young son in the arts, music and literature before he had even started elementary school. Needless to say that by the time Peter had reached the 12th grade of the prestigious Roxbury Latin School for Boys, and after acing a number of IQ tests, he garnered quite a reputation amongst the other students and teachers alike as a highly intelligent and sensitive boy who was destined for truly great things. Not many of his friends and family were surprised when his academic career continued to go from strength to strength, when the young prodigy won a place at the highly distinguished Harvard University to major in the challenging subject of classical languages. It was at Harvard that Peter really found his home away from home and started to blossom into a full-blown musical talent. Surrounded by fellow artists like Douglas Kenney, the founder of the genius National Lampoon comedy magazine, Harold Ramis, the director of Groundhog Day, the band Street Choir and his lifelong lover Lucy Fisher, the spirited and bright boy swapped the dusty old books on classical languages and picked up a harmonica instead. Like most things Peter would turn his hand to, he quickly became a masterful harmonica player, with even the legendary blues musician Muddy Waters calling him the greatest harp player alive. Van Dyke Parks, who later became the lyricist for the Beach Boys and attended Harvard with Peter, said of his good friend's musical instrument, one of the things that made him so singular was the harmonica. The herd was stampeding to either guitars or the piano. The harmonica put him in a singular place. Peter was an inveterate iconoclast. His general demeanour was anti-authoritarian. During his college days, Peter was extremely popular with everyone who met him. Fellow peers loved spending time with him because he could wow them just as easily with his slightly biting humour as he could with his performances with his harmonica. Peter performed often with his band The Street Choir at various clubs and bars around Boston, and really started to make a name for himself in the indie music scene. But 2 years after graduating, and always his mother's son, he was starting to feel tied down and restricted in what he really wanted to do. So in 1969 he decided to try his luck at being a solo performer. He also decided he needed a change of scenery from the conservative atmosphere of Boston to somewhere hot and creative, somewhere like Los Angeles. Friend and sometime collaborator Paul Leonard summed Peter up perfectly when he stated, "This thrilling individual was absolutely fearless. He didn't give a shit. He was just going to go and be who he wanted to be." Peter worked day and night on his debut album, Night of the Blue Communion, with vocalist Yolanda Bavin. Music executives responded positively, telling him they thought the album was an experimental masterpiece, twisting and blending genres. Peter was overjoyed when he signed a 2-album contract with Epic Records. Unfortunately, on the record's release day, the responses and the reviews from critics were lukewarm, and feeling a little dejected but still hopeful, Peter got right back to work in the studio to start putting together his follow-up album, Take It Out on Me, which would sadly be pushed aside by Epic after another dismal response to the first single released from the album titled Ain't That Peculiar. The record label cut ties with him, and Peter returned to writing songs for other performers to pay the bills. Luckily, with some help from his college buddy Van Dyke Parks, Peter was able to sign a new recording contract with Warner Brothers in 1974 after he impressed record executives by climbing up on their meeting table and playing his harmonica in a crazy impromptu performance. By this time, Peter and his girlfriend Lucy were living in the bohemian neighborhood of Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles, California. Just over a decade later, the neighborhood would become infamous across the United States for the Wonderland slayings. If you haven't already, please do check out our previous podcast exclusive, where we do a deep dive into this baffling case. However, Laurel Canyon in the 1970s was still a vibrant and artistic locale, and Lucy said of their adoration of the place, "It was a fairy tale land for us. Music literally bounced across the canyon all the time." The young artistic lovers found a cheap apartment and started to immerse themselves in the counterculture and the creative vibe of California in the golden era of hippies, exploration and innovation. Good friends of Peter and Lucy, Douglas Kenny and Harold Ramis, stopped by their apartment often, bringing along Hollywood big names like John Belushi, Starsky and Hutch actor Paul Michael Glaser, and filmmaker David Lynch, whom the musician had recently met at the American Film Institute. He was kind of in a world of his own, an intellectual pop artist, ahead of his time, Lynch said of Peter years later. Their home was a hub of artists, musicians and writers, a melting pot of creativity, and it seemed as though everyone wanted to be close with the affable, witty and aspiring musician who opened his door to everyone and anyone. Although longtime girlfriend Lucy was sometimes a little uncomfortable with it, Peter would even invite homeless people off the street into his home to talk or play music together. Peter's curiosity about the human experience was his blessing, but also a bit of a challenge. He was interested in interacting with anybody and anything, even if it was to elicit shock. It was always about having an encounter as opposed to gliding through life unaware. The amount of different personalities and vivid little portraits that are explored in his music capture the way he was. He would make a moment out of anything. He was such a touchstone for so many people, she said years later about him. In the mid-1970s, Peter got two of the big breaks he had been waiting all his life for. He started opening concerts for the massively popular British-American rock band Fleetwood Mac, and his friend David Lynch asked him to write the music for his psychological body horror film Eraserhead. Although the opening for Fleetwood Mac didn't quite go as expected, with Peter being booed off stage, the movie Eraserhead would go on to become a cult classic enjoyed around the world, and Peter's main featured song, titled In Heaven, with its haunting lyrics and harmonica riffs, would garner acclaim from critics, film fans and other musicians alike, such as the Pixies, who would later release their own popular cover version of this song. It was due to the success of In Heaven that Ron Howard, the star of the sitcom Happy Days and film director, asked Peter to score his debut movie, Grand Theft Auto. It was an opportunity that placed Peter on the very cusp of countrywide mainstream success. However, he would remain on the edge of commercial success, though according to Lucy, it was where he always loved to be, whether that be musically or in his lifestyle. Peter liked the edge, she said. By the early 80s, although Peter was still successfully writing songs for the likes of Diana Ross and the Pointer Sisters, he was beginning to steer his creative pursuits into the realm of performance art. After meeting wildman and mysterious television producer, as well as alleged drug dealer to the Rolling Stones David Jove, Peter began hosting for a late-night cable show on the USA Network called New Wave Theatre, showcasing new wave musicians and punk bands like Black Flag, the Dead Kennedys and Bad Religion, to name just a few. The New Wave Theatre was a very low-budget amateur production with shaky camera work and cheap sets, but it soon became a massive indie hit with the youth of the United States. The fun-loving and boyish Peter, despite his often contentious relationship with the burly producer and creator of the show, David Jove, really captured the hearts and minds of viewers, becoming somewhat of an underground cult icon, dubbed the New Wave Dick Clark, for his biting wit, glittery tuxedos, poetic soliloquies and musical riffs. Even when putting down a band, it was fun-loving. He wasn't purposefully hurting them, but because of his great intelligence, it was like placing a Neanderthal man next to Einstein, Lynch said of his friend's hosting style on the show. Peter and the New Wave Theatre changed music shows on television forever. MTV came around, and music television, punk rock, all of that became mainstream entertainment. New Wave Theatre was way more important than it has ever gotten credit for, stated Ivers' biographer Josh Frank. Even with all of his achievements, by the summer of 1982, Peter suffered some brutal setbacks and was feeling pretty down. Two of his close friends, Douglas Kenny and John Belushi, had died under tragic circumstances. His music still hadn't made it into the mainstream, and his relationship with his long-term girlfriend Lucy Fisher had started to break down. Peter, unable to stay in Laurel Canyon with a broken heart, made the decision to move again, this time further downtown to the notorious Skid Row neighborhood of Little Tokyo, despite strong objections from friends like David Lynch, who said the place was a hellhole where nobody moved to, and his now ex-girlfriend Lucy, who stated years later, these were very crude, large loft spaces previously used for industrial businesses. I was concerned. He wanted a bigger space where he could rehearse, but it was a scary place. At the time of all this upheaval, Peter was also debating whether or not he wanted to continue hosting New Wave Theatre, which was causing a lot of bad blood between him and producer David Jove, who was reportedly high on cocaine most of the time and prone to violent outbursts on set. Their relationship had always been a slightly contentious one, but now the atmosphere of the cable show was more one of anger and menace, so much so that a lot of the punk bands were refusing to go on the television show because they were scared of Jove and his aggressive unpredictability. In Little Tokyo, Peter found exactly what he was looking for, a large 6th-floor loft apartment in a converted factory. He moved in with his expensive audio equipment and what other little belongings he had and made himself at home. Tragically, the concerns of his friends and loved ones would be horribly realised on the 3rd of March, 1983. Harold Ramis's wife Anne had been trying to reach Peter on the telephone for hours. The longtime friends had made a promise to chat on the phone before meeting that day, but it would simply ring and ring endlessly. After trying to contact him for a couple of hours with no response, Anne was becoming extremely worried. This kind of behaviour was just not like Peter at all. She called the neighbours downstairs and asked them if they would go and knock on his door and make sure he was all right. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, as the neighbours walked up the rickety stairs and reached the 6th floor, they automatically knew something wasn't right. Peter's door was ajar, and through a gap they could see into his apartment. They called out his name, but when there was no response, they pushed the door open and tentatively entered the loft space. They found Peter sprawled on the bed, wearing the same clothes he had been wearing the day before. The duvet and bed sheets were saturated with blood, and Peter's face was completely unrecognisable. A large wooden hammer that the apartment building's residents kept in the communal kitchen on the 1st floor for their own safety lay cast aside, drenched in blood and hair, on the floor a few feet away from the bed. The 36-year-old musician, who didn't seem to have an enemy in the world, had been viciously and brutally beaten to death. The neighbours called the police immediately, but unfortunately the murder investigation would be a disaster from the very start. A few of Peter's friends who had heard the tragic news from Anne would arrive before the authorities, and when the responding officers finally did get to the apartment, they didn't cordon off the area, and instead allowed everyone to traipse around the crime scene. The crime scene was so polluted by the time I got there, people were already milling around. They hadn't cordoned it off, which was basically 101 of what you do at a murder scene, commented Lucy later to a reporter. The patrolmen also seemed inexperienced and confused as to what exactly they should do next. One of them reportedly turned to Peter's friend, Starsky and Hutch actor Paul Michael Glaser, and asked him what he thought they should do. He apparently responded angrily by telling them he was just an actor who played a detective on a television show. He didn't know. Even more bewilderingly, the responding officers allowed David Jove to remove the bloody sheets and linens from Peter's bed and leave the building with them. Why Jove did this has never been fully explained, and unfortunately he took any answers to that question with him to the grave when he died of cancer in 2004. Hank Petrosky, one of LAPD's detectives who investigated Peter's case, agreed years later that the initial response had been awful. He stated, "Oh no, it was crummy. I would have been so pissed at the patrolman because their job was to secure the scene." The murder was splashed across the front pages of newspapers coast to coast, and the grisly details were played out on radio stations all across America. LAPD detectives spent the following weeks canvassing the neighbourhood and chasing down leads, but came up with nothing at every single turn. They had no witnesses, no people of interest, no plausible suspects. Not a single suspicious fingerprint was found at the scene, nor on the wooden hammer. Detectives were at a complete loss, and when it was noted that Peter's audio equipment was missing from the apartment, they quickly deduced that the horrific murder was simply a robbery gone wrong. Although Petrosky still had his suspicions, he commented, "You could see where the stereo equipment would have been. There were some wires still there, so it was obvious that something was missing from the shelf. Now that could have been a thing to fake us out. I've already killed him for this, but now I'm going to steal his stereo equipment and they'll think it's some burglar." But if the audio equipment had been taken as an afterthought by the culprit to mask the motive for the slaying, who in Peter's circle could that have been? Peter's best friends and loved ones all pointed their fingers in the direction of the man who had been allowed to remove the bloody sheets from the crime scene. New wave theatre producer David Jove. Director Harold Ramis would later voice his suspicions of Jove to a biographer, saying, "As I grew to know David a little better, it just accumulated. All the clues and evidence just made me think he was capable of anything. I couldn't say with certainty that he'd done anything, but of all the people I knew, he was the one person I couldn't rule out." The LAPD, for reasons that remain unknown, refused to investigate the possibility that Jove was the killer. Not long after Peter's murder, a burglar fell to his death. He had been attempting to rob a loft apartment a few blocks away from Peter's. They pretty much deduced that this man was the culprit, and put the investigation on the back burner until it went cold. They came up with a suspect who was a rooftop burglar who fell off a roof, as being the most likely suspect. I know there are a lot of people that think there's other people involved, but it doesn't appear that way. You would like to have better answers, but I don't think there ever will be. I think this is it, said an LAPD cold case detective who commented years later when he was asked to reopen the case by Peter's biographer. Lucy refused to give up, and hired a private investigator who went over the case with a fine-tooth comb, recanvassing the Skid Row neighbourhood and re-interviewing Peter's friends and acquaintances. "I do not believe it was just someone off the street that Peter brought in because he was a nice guy that night and fell asleep trusting them. I'm not buying it," the PI said. However, despite all of his criticisms of the Los Angeles Police Department's handling of the case, and his strong beliefs as to what really happened to Peter that night, he too was unable to come up with any viable suspects or hard evidence that incriminated Jove, or anyone else for that matter. Lucy kept the private investigator on Peter's case for a year, but each and every day searching and yearning for the truth proved to be too heartbreaking for the now Hollywood executive. "After a year I decided I wasn't going to open that door anymore. I do think it's possible that it was somebody crazy that he knew, but I think it was also possible it was a passerby who heard music coming out of there and knew. Equipment was stolen and the door was not locked. Peter could do everything except lock a door, basically." As of the writing of this episode, Peter's case has been cold for 41 years. The LAPD did reopen it briefly in 2008, but reached the same conclusions as detectives in 1983, that the murder was probably committed by a passing burglar who heard music coming out of Peter's window and decided to rob his apartment when they found his front door open, killing him in the process and then falling to their own death weeks later in a botched robbery. Without any fingerprints or forensic evidence to speak of, Peter's killer will tragically never be known. However, what is known is that Peter Ivers was an incredibly intelligent and talented musician who had his life stolen when he was on the very edge of the mainstream success he desperately strove all his life for. He was loved by so many and really played an important role in the emergence of both punk and new wave music as we know them today. Screenwriter Josh Frank summed up Peter's contribution to modern music and art when he stated, "He was the centerpiece of the wheel that our pop culture history turned around in the 1970s and 1980s. Even though his output didn't necessarily stick, in one way or another he helped many of the other artists of his time get their success, like David Lynch. He was a connector, he connected to people. Also, he was ahead of the curve when it came to video art and mixing video and music." Peter's music is still widely available and can be found online wherever great music is played. We hope that this podcast has been able to bring some light into Peter's tragic and mysterious case, and also, hopefully, introduce the great man's music to some new fans.